Chapter 1. Concerning Mr. Currie's leading argument from authorities and the accusations of untruths, etc., that are laid against the defense. Mr. Currie, in his essay on vindication, fills his page with quotations from great and eminent men. On every turn he tells his reader, this great man says so, and the other great man says so. And in his preface to the essay, pages 7 and 8, he alleges he gives the quotations from them with their reasons and arguments supporting their sentiments, and therefore he complains loudly in his vindication, page 5, that I have not attempted to take off the force of their authority, except as to a very few in one section, and that I have not answered the reasons adduced by such great men, which he reckons I was as much obliged to make answer unto as anything in his essay. But I gave a reason, defense, preface, page 8, why I neglected Mr. Currie's quotations, that is, that the most part of his quotations are applied in a manner contrary unto the intention and design of the worthy authors, in the connection of the purposes which they treat, and out of which they are taken it is duly considered. And to prove this, I thought it sufficient if I gave some instances of his most considerable writers, and therefore, Defense Chapter 3, Section 2, I make mention of several of them, such as Calvin, Durham, Rutherford, and Gillespie, and after I have given some account from Mr. Bailey of the principles of the sectarians, against which the reasonings of the above great men are pointed, I show the vast difference that there are betwixt the principles upon which the secession of the Associate Presbytery is stated, and the exploded principles of the sectarians. And I likewise show that Mr. Currie's authorities do not touch on the question betwixt the present judicatories and the Associate Presbytery, but that many of them are directed against the extravagant sectarian principles that then prevailed. And, to satisfy the reader that my observation is just, I shall only consider one or two of these quotations that Mr. Currie insists upon in his present vindication. The first I mention is a long quotation from Mr. Durham, essay page 52, which stands, defense, page 194. Thus, quote, Our Lord Jesus is no approver or countenancer of separation from a true church, for the faults of some members in it. Neither do faults in some members and defects in ministers and officers in executing discipline pollute the ordinances in themselves or to others who are free of that guilt, unquote. And here I observe, defense, page 204, that Mr. Durham's words are plain and pointed against such who affirm that the personal facts and of joint worshippers pollute the ordinances in themselves or to others. But this is not of the principles of the Associate Presbytery, neither do they affirm that faults in some members or defects in ministers or officers in executing discipline do pollute the ordinances in the manner mentioned. And yet in the same place I assert that secession is warrantable and necessary from a particular visible church that in her ecclesiastical capacity, or when in her ecclesiastical capacity, she is carrying on a course of defection from steps of reformation once attained unto, and at the same time refusing to be reclaimed. And this principle is far different from the above sectarian principle condemned by Mr. Durham, as east is from west. The reason why I have taken particular notice of the above quotation from Mr. Durham is because Mr. Currie, in his vindication, page 189, alleges that I have dealt unfairly in the said quotation and in his boasting manner. Quote, he defies Mr. Wilson or his brethren to instance anything like this in any quotation of his form first to last in the essay, unquote. Sure, the reader may think that I have set my thumb upon some weighty and strong argument that Mr. Durham's words afford against the Associate Presbytery. What are the words which I have omitted? They are even the following, and so do not necessitate separation from a church or any ordinance thereof. Here, then, according to Mr. Currie, is a strong argument from Mr. Durham against our secession, that is, faults in some members and defects in ministers and officers in executing discipline do not pollute the ordinances in themselves or unto others, and therefore do not necessitate separation from a true church. I grant the whole, and after Mr. Currie has got the words which I omitted, and which he lays so much stress and weight upon, what has he gained? 'Tis still evident and plain that Mr. Durham is speaking against separation from a true church, which proceeds upon this principle, that the faults and defects mentioned pollute the ordinances in themselves or to others. Mr. Currie owns that some other words that cite from Mr. Durham prove indeed that he speaks against the above principle of the sectarians, but still he applies Mr. Durham's reasonings against the seceding brethren, and to instruct the justness of the allegation and my unfair dealings with Mr. Durham, he desires the reader may compare the 194th page of the defense with the last two leaves of Mr. Durham's commentaries upon the second chapter of Revelation. And I likewise join with Mr. Currie in desiring the reader to make the comparison betwixt the places mentioned, and let him judge for himself of the justice or injustice of Mr. Currie's reasonings, and of the charge of unfair dealing that he has laid against me. Since Mr. Currie has challenged me and the brethren whom he names to instance anything like the above, which he calls an unfair question in his essay from first to last, I answer, I have given frequent instances of his curtailing authors whom he cites, and of his leaving out such sentences as are necessary to give us their true sense and meaning. As, for instance, when he quotes the Act of Assembly 1638, which he represents as a tyrannical act, which is one of his commonplace arguments in his essay, he scarce gives us the one half of it. He still leaves out that part of the act which contains the reasons of the same, and consequently that part of the act which gives us the genuine sense and meaning of the assembly. And I reckon that an author is unfairly quoted when any of his words are omitted, which gives us his just and true meaning. I give another instance of this likewise, Defense, page 193, where I take notice of a long quotation that the essay gives us from Mr. Rutherford, and then I observe that Mr. Currie sets his thumb upon the conclusion of the said quotation, which is laid in the following terms, quote, Then 'tis lawful to separate from the true worship of God, because a church is not constitute of visible saints, and a people all taught of God, unquote. Whence I observe that Mr. Rutherford's testimony is directed against those that plead that positive signs of conversion and regeneration are necessary qualifications of church members, and consequently that the seceding ministers have no concern in this testimony, that Mr. Currie alleges against them from Mr. Rutherford. I likewise reckon it very unjust and unfair when Mr. Currie conceals the above conclusion which Mr. Rutherford gives to his argument. But, says Mr. Currie in Vindication, page 188, quote, It was not necessary to give the above words, unquote. And why? Says Mr. Currie, because he cited Mr. Rutherford only to prove that for all the faults that were instanced by the apostle in the church of Corinth, yet the apostle was against separation from that church, and instead of that, commands them to meet together, which, says Mr. Currie, quote, is a demonstration that such faults as were in that church are not ground of separation from any church of Christ, unquote. But does not Mr. Rutherford give several particular instances of the faults in that church to prove that 'tis unlawful to separate from the true worship of God because a church is not constituted of visible saints? And Mr. Currie may know that this is not a point in question betwixt him and me. Mr. Currie adds, quote, As Mr. Rutherford in his writings pleads against positive signs of regeneration being requisite qualifications of church members, so he pleads against separation from a church of Christ, though her faults should be many, unquote. What then? Even so say I. Though there may be many personal faults and defects in church members, both office-bearers and others, this does not warrant separation from a true church of Christ. But unless Mr. Currie can instruct that Rutherford, Durham, Gillespie, and other great divines he names plead for ecclesiastical union and conjunction with a particular visible church when she is carrying on, in her ecclesiastical capacity, a complex course of defection from Reformation principles once attained unto, and this notwithstanding of the ordinary means used to reclaim them, as also that, in this case, these that desire to confess, own, and acknowledge the principles mentioned, though the lesser part by far, may not depart from union and conjunction with the majority, and, as a separate and distinct body by themselves, make public confession of their received principles in opposition to the injuries done to the same. Unless, I say, Mr. Currie can instruct that the several eminent divines he mentions have pled and asserted as above, he may spare all his labor. His numerous quotations are all to no purpose. They never touch on the cause or question as 'tis stated betwixt the Associate Presbytery and the present judicatories. The above instances from Masters Durham and Rutherford are two amongst the rest that I consider in the defense. Whereas Mr. Currie complains of my neglect of many other authorities he has advanced in his essay, I shall therefore give one instance of such neglect, and the instance that I give is one that Mr. Currie seems to be most warm upon, and if I had neglected one of his most material testimonies against the seceding brethren, it is a quotation from the Helvetic Confession, and it runs thus, essay page 49, quote, We esteem so highly the communion with the true church of Christ, that we deny they can live before God, who do not communicate with the true church of God, but separate themselves from it. As without the ark of Noah there was no salvation, but the world perished in the deluge. So we believe that without Christ, who offers himself to be received in the church, there is no certain salvation, and therefore we teach that they who would live, they ought not separate from a true church of Christ. Unquote. Mr. Currie, in his vindication, page 4, marginal note, tells his reader the above authority, quote, Mr. Wilson thought so hot that he durst not touch it, unquote. He likewise concludes from the above testimony that 'tis evident to a demonstration that the seceding brethren act in direct opposition to Reformation principles and to the principles of the Reformed churches, unquote. If what Mr. Currie says is evident to a demonstration, then, to be sure, the above words of the Helvetic Confession contain some very plain and evident argument against the seceding ministers. And since I must answer to the arguments that are contained in the authors that Mr. Currie brings against us, I must consider how the argument must be laid from the above quotation. And if I do not mistake, it runs thus. They cannot live before God who do not communicate with the true Church of God, but separate themselves from it. But the Church of Scotland, as she is represented in her present judicatories, is a true Church of God. Therefore they cannot live before God who separate from the present judicatories. The reason of the first proposition is, as all perished who were without the ark of Noah, so all must perish eternally who make a secession from what Mr. Currie reckons a true church. Mr. Currie's quotation must be applied in the manner above expressed if it have any significancy at all in the present question. And if the above words of the Helvetic Confession must be applied this way, I must confess the argument is too hot for me. At this rate, not only the seceding ministers, but all in Scotland who do not join in communion with the present established church are all shut up in a perishing state. They are in the same hopeless and desperate estate with the damned in hell, unless they return to communion with the established church. But the words of the above confession are not so very hot, but that I dare touch them without prejudice and hurt, and in their sense were not perverted. And if Mr. Currie were not guilty of taking from the words of that confession, they would be found to contain a very great truth, and not the least shadow of an argument against the seceding ministers. The church concerning which the Helvetic Confession speaks is not any particular visible church, but the Catholic Church, that is, the church which is there compared to the Ark of Noah. Even according to Mr. Currie's translation of the words, quote, So we believe that without Christ, who offers himself to be received in the church, there is no certain salvation, unquote. They must be applied to the Church Catholic, for this is what is common to the whole to the whole Catholic Church, and not peculiar to any particular visible church. This will yet further appear from the words as they run in the Latin syntagma, which are ida credimus extra Christum, qui se electus in ecclesiae, frudendum, praebit nullum esse salutem certum. That is, quote, So we believe that without Christ, who gives himself to be enjoined by the elect in the church, there is no certain salvation, unquote. It is plain that in the above words the confession speaks not of this general offer of Christ which is common to all in the church, as Mr. Currie by his translation would have, but of the giving of Christ to the elect in the church in actual possession and enjoyment, which cannot be restricted to any particular church, but must be applied to the Catholic Church. And though the words of the Helvetic Confession should be understood according to Mr. Currie's curtailed translation, they only import that out of the Catholic Church, where Christ is offered, there is no ordinary possibility of salvation, which is likewise the doctrine of our Westminster Confession, chapter 25, article 2. And from the whole, it is so far from being evident to demonstration, as Mr. Currie writes, that our secession is contrary to the principles of the Reformed churches, that it is most agreeable to them. In regard, our secession from the present judicatories is not from the Catholic Church, nor from the faith of the Catholic Church, as also in regard our secession is founded upon a confession of such principles as are confessed by the Reformed churches in their several confessions. I judge it needless to pursue Mr. Currie further in his argument taken from authorities, since I find no more weight in any of them than in these I have mentioned. I shall therefore close this head with one observation more, that is, when Mr. Currie finds our Reformed divines condemning separation from true churches, he presently concludes that all their arguments may be applied against the seceding ministers. But in this he still begs what is in question. For I have still refused, and do refuse, for the many weighty reasons and arguments I have advanced in the defense, that this national church, as she is represented in her present judicatories, is a true church.